Hello everyone, I'm Mika Thrimsdottir, and this is Seeking Dinah, where I go down various mystical rabbit holes to see what, or who, I can find, to help dig out unhealthy social structures and stereotypes at their roots. In this set of videos on Genesis, I'll be using a close reading of the first book in the Bible to understand the tragedy of Dinah, which has always bothered me. In the myth history of the people of Israel, Dinah is the only daughter born to Jacob, who is more famous for his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. If you're familiar with the stories of Genesis, you might have noticed that Dinah gets one dramatic story from her youth and then just disappears. There's no record of her after that at all. And although her father does eventually condemn her brothers, who were horrible people, and no, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, I've never really felt satisfied with how her story gets interpreted. One of the biggest problems with her story is that it wasn't written by a woman. In fact, none of the women in Genesis are shared with us through a woman's perspective. And I have so many questions! But there's no reason I can't comb through the narrative looking for ways to construct a woman's perspective. So, using bits and pieces from archaeology and literature and myth, as well as the text of Genesis, I'm going to see what I can do to reframe this story, which, as it turns out, is also the story of Dinah's mother, grandmother, and of course her great-grandmother Sarah, who started it all. In this video, we're going to look at Sarah a little more closely, what her culture might have looked like, how she might have experienced the world, and what considerations probably influenced important decisions like, inheritance, for example, and status. Once upon a time, and we're dealing with myth and legend here, so who knows for sure, but somewhere in between the founding of the first cities and the growth of the early empires, so let's say between 3000 and 2000 BCE, there was a woman named Sarah. Sarah was the daughter of a woman whose name we don't know, and a man named Terah. He had at least one more wife, whose name we don't know either, and 3 sons, Abraham, Haran, and Nahor. When they were all growing up as kids, Sarah and Abraham were known as Sarai and Abram, or Abram. They got an extra H added to their names later. The book of Genesis tells us that this rather large household lived in the city of Ur, in what is historically known as Sumeria. So, what was Sumeria like once upon a time? How might little Sarai have grown up? Ancient Sumeria is located on the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It is a loosely connected group of city-states who shared similar beliefs and customs. Uruk and Ur are among the oldest cities in this region, and although Uruk was more important, Ur was pretty significant too. Close to the center of the ancient city of Ur, the reconstructed monumental ziggurat visible today probably wasn't part of Sarah's world, but the god it was built for was. This ziggurat was dedicated to Nana, or Sin, the Sumerian god of the moon, who was the patron god of Ur from its earliest founding and one of the most important gods of ancient Sumeria, at least from a practical point of view. Sarah would have known this god very well. Nana, or Sin, or however you want to say his name, usually used the crescent moon as his symbol. Another symbol was the bull, because Nana wasn't just the god of the moon. He was a pastoralist god, who watched over cow herds most famously, but of course also goat herds and shepherds, like the people of Sarah's family. No matter how important Nana was to the people of Ur, however, there were a few gods who were more important. One of them was the moon's father, a god named Enlil, who was the god of the mountains and the winds. His name is sometimes translated as ghost god or spirit god, and he was worshipped best at Nippur. Enki, or Ea, is just as old as Enlil. He was the god of the Abzu, the great waters under the world, and he's the one who created people. He's also associated with miracles and magic, with wisdom, and with the great things of civilization. His center of worship was at Eridu. The father of all the gods is An, or Anu. His symbol is also the bull, but not the bull of the crescent moon. Anu's symbol is Taurus, one of the earliest signs of the zodiac. Here it is, right next to the constellation we call Orion. Being the father of the gods, Anu had a lot of temples in a lot of places, but one of the most important was at Uruk. There's another god who was worshipped at Uruk who can also be associated with the earliest signs of the zodiac, a god, or rather a goddess, that young Sarai would have known quite well. This is, of course, the goddess Inanna. Some of the earliest depictions of the goddess associate her with reeds and with the fertility of the land. By the time of the First Empire, however, she gets a name change, becoming Ishtar. She has the 8-pointed star, what we call Venus, as her symbol, and is equipped with wings on her back and a lion at her feet. This lion is another one of the earliest signs of the zodiac, of course, the constellation Leo. And now it's time for a bit of a tangent, because Inanna, or Ishtar, was one of the most popular goddesses in the Sumerian pantheon, and because this imagery, this idea of the woman and the lion, is not unique to Sumeria. One of the earliest cities that has ever been excavated, Çatalhöyük in Turkey, has a sculpture of a large, fat, nude woman who is often interpreted as giving birth, making her a mother. She sits on what can only be described as a throne in between two great cats. Thousands of years later, in a totally different cultural context, the same iconography and the same meaning appear together again, which is totally not normal. The Great Mother seated on a throne between two lions, in Rome as Mater Magna. If you are thinking about the cat goddesses of Egypt right about now, good, they're mothers too. And by the by, this goddess is still worshipped today as Durga, or sometimes Parvati, in Hindu theology. If you care to pay attention, An or Anu's shadow appears too, as Shiva and his bull. This is Sarah's world, the way she would have grown up. This is the pantheon she and her brothers knew. Their god wasn't the only god in the universe, far from it. There were gods everywhere. Now let's go back to Sarah's household to see what that looked like in a little more detail. I've already noted that Sarah's household growing up had a father, a couple of wives, and at least 4 kids. Probably more than that. Things get immediately weird, however, at least to modern sensibilities, when you realize that when they were old enough, Sarah and Abraham got married. In the cultural traditions that many of us are used to, this is called incest, and it is not okay. But that isn't even the weirdest thing. Haran has a daughter named Milcah, who marries her uncle Nahor, and eventually, well, hang on. Let's look at this for a minute, because we need to totally adjust our worldview. How is it even thinkable that Sarah could marry her half-brother, and what girl in her right mind would marry her biological uncle? And what kind of father would be okay with it? That depends, really, on how you define a household. The kind of system that many people today are most accustomed to is called patriarchy, because a household is traditionally defined by its governing father, or patriarch. Inheritance passes through the male line, and a daughter goes to live with her husband's family most of the time. If she's lucky, she'll get something too, a dowry to help her get started in her new home. In this kind of system, there are a lot of restrictions about who can marry whom. There have to be, because, well, let's be honest, this is a fundamentally weak system of inheritance. Without DNA testing, it can be awfully hard to know whether your sons are actually yours, or if they were fathered by someone else. One of the simplest and most effective methods for ensuring bloodline inheritance in this kind of system is to restrict access to the patriarch's breeding partner, keeping her safe from unauthorized men, or from all men really, because none of them can be trusted to see a woman as a human being rather than a power source. See, a large household is a fundamental source of power and authority, and the size of the household is determined by its number of children, and that is determined by childbearing women. Of course, not all women can bear children, and not all women can give birth to many children. So what's a patriarch to do? The answer is, of course, more women! This is why we get so bothered by Sarah's marriage to her half-brother. In the patriarchal system, all of these people are in the same household. Incest rules all over the world state that marriage within the same household is not okay, unless you're a god king of ancient Egypt, of course. But this is only one way of defining a household, and as we've already seen, it isn't terribly efficient. It's also kind of toxic because it only allows two ways of being in the world. There is very little room for a woman who can't bear sons. Even worse is, say, a marriageable, eligible woman who doesn't want to be married, or a marriageable, eligible man who doesn't or can't father children. They exist anyway, of course, but they don't necessarily belong. What does this have to do with Sarah's family? Everything. Our first hint that Sarah did not live in a patriarchal society, not as we think of it anyway, is because of her marriage, which was perfectly legal because she and Abraham had different mothers. This means that they didn't just have different mothers. It means they lived in different households. In this model, then, we're looking at 3 households, not 1. And that means we're looking at the remnants, at least, of a matriarchy. That shouldn't be terribly surprising. After all, Adam's first and only recorded commandment to all of humanity states that a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave unto his wife, which is exactly the opposite of patriarchal practice, and that's our second hint. So what does society look like when boys leave home to get married and when household identity is determined by your mother rather than your father? First, a system like this does not need any of the restrictions that patriarchy does, because it is a good deal more difficult to falsify the process of giving birth than it is to fake conception. Nor can a woman bear more children if she has more lovers, so harems of whatever gender would be redundant. As a result, neither women nor men have to worry about being reduced to breeding stock. Children are not guaranteed because fertility is fickle. When they do come, there's no need to segregate them or force them into a false binary. Forced gender roles serve no real purpose. A person able and willing to have children will do so and reap the benefits. A person who cannot, well, the continued story of Sarah tells us what happens when a person cannot. As beautiful as Sarah was, and although she spent plenty of time in the courts of kings, she couldn't have children. She and Abraham had been promised children, however, and Sarah intended to see that promise fulfilled. She suggested using a surrogate, in fact, her maid Hagar. And here's where everything went sideways. Hagar didn't become a surrogate for Sarah. She became Abraham's second wife, and pretty soon she became pregnant. Here is where we get our first huge culture clash, and here's our third hint that Sarah wasn't raised in a patriarchal society. As soon as it became obvious that Hagar was the mother of the promised offspring, she started moving in on Sarah's authority. And if she'd still been back in Egypt, maybe it would have worked. Abraham wouldn't have been the first to throw over his infertile first wife for the fertile second wife, after all. But this wasn't Egypt, and Hagar wasn't a member of Abraham's household. She was a member of Sarah's. This is reiterated several times. When Sarah chastises Abraham for giving Hagar false ideas about her own authority, and when Hagar, fleeing into the wilderness, receives revelation about her son. Hagar does have a son, Ishmael, and he is almost grown by the time Sarah miraculously gets pregnant herself. She gives birth to a son too, Isaac. Now we get more hints that Hagar's relationship with Sarah hasn't improved any, and that she has taught the same disrespect to her son, Ishmael. Ishmael, although the precious and beloved eldest son, gets himself and his mother kicked out of the household when Sarah sees him mocking her joy over miraculously becoming a mother herself. Once again, even though Abraham isn't happy about it, Sarah is in charge of who stays and who goes in what is obviously her household. And now we come to the next really important moment, the time of inheritance. Sarah dies, leaving her husband and her son behind. What happens next? Well, Abraham gets married again, but he doesn't give his new wife Sarah's tent or household goods. She gets her own. Once again, Sarah's goods are Sarah's. They're not even her sons, not really. What does Abraham do about that? He sends his servant to find Isaac a wife, but not just any wife. He wants Isaac to have a wife from back home, from his own people, who are also, if you remember, Sarah's people. A woman from Sarah's people would be a legitimate heir for her household goods, and presumably someone Sarah would approve of her son marrying. Back to our little pedigree chart. We do not know who Haran's wife was. Was she one of Sarah's sisters? Was she someone totally different? Oh. What we do know is that Milcah was Sarah's paternal niece and her paternal sister-in-law. Her son Bethuel had 2 children by his nameless wife, Laban and Rebekah. When Abraham's servant went to Samaria to look for a wife for Isaac, Rebekah is who he found, Isaac's first cousin twice removed. Now let's look at this from Sarah's point of view, even though she was dead by the time Rebekah came into her tent. Rebekah, however miraculously discovered, was both Sarah's great-niece and her great-great-niece. Either way, she was family, and thus a legitimate matriarchal choice for inheriting Sarah's household goods. The bride price that Abraham's servant paid for Rebekah could as easily be treated as an adoption fee. Rebekah was going to become her aunt's successor. Rebekah came from Samaria, just as Sarah had. Rebekah knew the same gods. She would have recognized An and Enki and Enlil and Inanna and Nana, who in some accounts are father and daughter and in some accounts siblings. She would have known the rites of women that were practiced in the house, the ways of cooking and cleaning and worshipping the gods that women of her family and her people knew, that outsiders would not. This is what Rebekah brought with her to her new husband's family. This culture was clearly important to Abraham and to Isaac. Was it important to Rebekah too? Absolutely. And we'll get to that in part 2. See you next time, and thanks for watching.